Okay, wonderful. So thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the wonderful previous presentation. I'm going to present to you evidence from a brand new paper. It's currently under revision, and what it did was bring together 41 authors who are experts in all areas of social behavioral science to try to leverage the last century of insights that we have on topics that we thought were relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic response. And so although I'm going to present this, I'm the lead author, credit goes to all of my brilliant collaborators. Many of this is drawing on their expertise and their own research in the area. So our launching point is coming from the lessons from the last major global pandemic that seems parallel in terms of its global devastation, which was the Spanish flu. And in 1919, Science magazine published a paper that basically summarized some of the core lessons from that pandemic. And three of the challenges that they noticed from dealing with the pandemic and basically the social and behavioral science of it was that people do not often appreciate the risks they run, in part because they can't see it. A lot of the types of risks are subtle. Many people might be asymptomatic, and so they're not good at estimating the risks and potential threat to themselves, and that leads them to engage in behaviors that are potentially threatening to themselves and others. Another thing they noticed is that it goes against human nature for people to shut themselves up in rigid isolation as a means of protecting others. Our intuitions about morality and prosociality often involve images or memories of trying to reach out to somebody. So helping somebody who's suffering, running into a fire to rescue somebody. The types of images that we see in news of heroes and people who are engaging pro-social behavior almost always take that form. The form of prosociality in a pandemic is almost the exact opposite of what our intuitions are that we built up about the right thing to do to help others throughout our entire lives. And so that makes it a challenge to communicate that and for people to react in an appropriate way. Another thing that was noticed in the last major pandemic from over 100 years ago is that people often unconsciously act as a continuing danger to themselves and others. The key word here is unconsciously. A lot of times they're not realizing the harm that they're putting others in. And again, it's because transmission is often invisible. The potential symptoms of COVID don't appear for several days. And so this means that people are doing all kinds of things that are unconscious. And what that means is we need to design and leverage social and behavioral science that can nudge behavior in the right way, that might help people act in an appropriate way that promotes public health, even if it doesn't go against their conscious intentions. And the reasoning that all of this science is useful, and many of you by now have seen these wonderful images and GIFs about flattening the curve to stop the spread of the pandemic. What you'll notice in the bottom of this one, which I quite like, is the question here is fundamentally framed around a collective response. If everybody does their thing in different ways by washing their hands, canceling events, social distancing, allocating resources fairly, working from home, not traveling, if we all do those things, everybody's better off. And so that's the first thing, is you need a collective response. It can't just be any individual heroic effort. And then the second thing you notice from it is if we let up, it's going to fall flat. So you have to think about sustainable ways of maintaining social connection and other psychological needs for people, managing their stress, social support, so that you don't have that rebound. And so there's two waves of thinking about the social and behavioral science around these issues. So what we've done is basically bring together all basically what we thought was a sample of the most relevant topics in the domain of social and behavioral science. This is an overview of our paper. If you look at the bottom, I have just updated the most recent version of our paper as a PDF, and you can download it from psycharchive.com at Y38M9. What you'll see in the paper is a brief but detailed description of all these issues. So I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights. There's no possible way in the next 5 minutes I can go through all the research for you, but I'm going to give you a sense, kind of a roadmap of what's in it. So you can see what's most relevant to your organization and then go in and check out that part of the paper, or you could read the whole paper if you have to deal with all these issues. The first section deals with threat perception, and it specifically deals with the ways that people cognitively respond to threats. Also, the fact that people tend to often underestimate the threats to them as individuals. And so they are overly optimistic, and so they might take risks even when they understand the objective threat to society. And so thinking about those issues is key. There's also research on risk perception. Under emotional circumstances, people have trouble processing numerical representations of risk. And so there's research and guidelines on that issue. Another challenge that happens in threatening situations, especially when around issues of contagion and contamination, is you see prejudice and discrimination, scapegoating of minorities. And so we talk about that and strategies for dealing with it. There is also a section on disaster and panic. The way the media often represents crises is that people are panicking. You see this with images of all the toilet paper being sold out in certain places. It turns out that actual panicking in the form of looting and extreme behavior rarely occurs. And so that's actually a misnomer or misrepresentation of how human nature actually tends to operate in most situations like this. So we talk about that. We also have a section on leadership, which we think is critical. And we draw on lessons from previous pandemics like Ebola to talk about what were successful messaging in other parts of the world to promote trust and compliance with regulations and how to get community leaders involved. We talk broadly about how leaders can frame goals to get everybody working together and how they can elevate the goals of the group without derogating out groups. Again, this is related to the prejudice issue, but you can see in some countries already a scapegoating of minorities is something that leaders do to try to get credit off themselves. And so we talk about strategies for effective leadership that don't involve that. In another section, we talk about how you can align individual and collective interests. People are often tempted to think of these issues in zero-sum thinking, and that's why they might hoard groceries or other goods. What they need to realize, or face masks, what they need to realize, and what we talk about how to do it, is that if other people are at risk, it puts you ultimately at risk and your family at risk. And that's an intuition that people often don't have in crises, but is particularly relevant to a pandemic. We talk about the dynamics of moral decision-making. When people, this is a challenge now, allocating resources, ventilators, how you can make those decisions, what are the key factors, how you can insulate doctors and medical practitioners from losing trust around those issues. We also talk about cooperation, how you can get people to make sacrifices in ways that benefit the group over themselves, and all the different tools about modeling good people who do that, having leaders model that themselves. In another section, we talk about science communication, and this actually connects nicely to the previous talk. We talk about the science of conspiracy theories and how they spread, and there's been a number of them around COVID-19. Not only about where it came from, how it's being spread, but also how to cure it, dangerous ideas floating around. And we talk about misinformation and fake news. And also we have several experts who've designed effective interventions for the belief and distribution of fake news. We also talk about effective strategies for persuasion. We have the world's leading expert on persuasion on our paper, talks about how tools you can do to persuade people and change their attitudes. We also talk about context and culture, because there's a number of, I would say, risk factors that make these, implementing these ideas more or less challenging. One thing is the social norms in an environment can be used for good or for bad. And that turns out to be a powerful way to change behavior even without changing beliefs or attitudes. Social inequality is turning out to be a massive factor for putting certain groups more or less at risk. You're seeing that here in New York, where I am, as well as all around the world. And that's, I think, going to be a bigger and bigger issue as the pandemic unfolds. We have several experts in culture who can see different patterns in different cultures. We often attribute these to medical public health responses, but there might be other aspects of norms and concerns about collective versus individual responsibilities and goals that do shape people's willingness to help others and listen to authority around the world. And we talk also about political polarization, how that is an issue and potentially a risk factor for some groups if their polarization, and some people don't trust experts or the media, the mainstream media, they can potentially put themselves at risk. And then finally, very briefly, the last section's on stress and coping. We talk about the devastation of social isolation, which some people have already said there's an epidemic of social isolation. We talk about how damaging that is to mental and physical health and what you can do to promote connection. We are also seeing a lot of issues in intimate relationships as people are getting stuck together. You're seeing spousal abuse going up in many places, divorce rates going up. So we talk about strategies and ways of thinking about those issues. And then in the last section, we talk about healthy mindsets. In some cases, in addition to trying to do all the right health behaviors, managing the way that you interpret the world turns out to have some benefits for people in terms of making them more resilient, maintaining their mental health, and engaging in a sustained positive behavior over time. So just very briefly, this is some of the kind of the take-home insights. This is just a brief sample. For one of the insights from one of the sections is that if you build a shared sense of identity, you can do it by addressing the public and collective terms using collective pronouns and urging people to act for the common good. You see this missing from a lot of rhetoric from leaders. Another thing is identifying sources of trust who are credible to different audiences to share public health messages. I know in the US, some people have done this with one of our top medical experts going on YouTube channels. During the Ebola crisis, it was with a lot of local community leaders. Right now, you're seeing a surge also in local newspapers, which have lost readership, and that's where people are going to for local information. Identifying that and getting voices to communicate these messages through them is more powerful. Also, to communicate positive norms and role models, you need in-group members. So people look to people like them, it also helps if they're well-connected. People who are hubs of social network can spread the disease, but they can also be powerful tools for spreading the right behaviors. And so if you can identify them and also signal that their behavior is socially approved when they do the right things, that it helps spread the right norms. Another thing is to help people, make people aware that they benefit from others' access to preventative measures to create a non-zero-sum mindset that promotes sharing, fair allocation of resources, not hoarding. Another insight or implication for policymakers is that you can prepare people for misinformation in advance and ensure that they have accurate information and counter arguments before they encounter it. This follows the logic of vaccination, and it's called inoculation. Just like you inoculate people with the flu shot, you can inoculate them against misinformation by giving them weak forms of the argument plus strong counter arguments. The other thing, finally, another implication around social isolation and stress is we use the term social distancing a lot. It might send the wrong implications. And so you could simply change it to physical distancing or distant socializing, because those signal that connection is possible with others even when people are physically separated. And so this is just a sample. Again, you can read the paper for many more kind of take-home messages. And I just, on that note, want to thank the many brilliant authors. Many of these are experts on specific areas I presented. And so you can go to their websites and see, find a right person, say if you're really interested in risk perception or misinformation or social isolation. Those experts are on this list. So thank you so much.